Les Misérables. Volume 1. Fantine. Book 8. A Counterblow. By Victor Hugo. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. Chapter 1. In what mirror Monsieur Madeleine contemplates his hair. The day had begun to dawn. Fantine had passed a sleepless and feverish night, filled with happy visions. At daybreak she fell asleep. Sister Simplice, who had been watching with her, availed herself of this slumber to go and prepare a new potion of cinchona. The worthy sister had been in the laboratory of the infirmary but a few moments, bending over her drugs and phials, and scrutinizing things very closely on account of the dimness which the half-light of dawn spreads over all objects. Suddenly she raised her head and uttered a faint shriek. Monsieur Madeleine stood before her. He had just entered silently. "Is it you, Mr. Mayor?" she exclaimed. He replied in a low voice, "How is that poor woman?" "Not so bad just now, but we have been very uneasy." She explained to him what had passed, that Fantine had been very ill the day before, and that she was better now because she thought that the mayor had gone to Montfermeil to get her child. The sister dared not question the mayor, but she perceived plainly from his air that he had not come from there. "All that is good," said he. "You were right not to undeceive her." "Yes," responded the sister, "but now, Mr. Mayor, she will see you and will not see her child. What shall we say to her?" He reflected for a moment. "God will inspire us," said he. "But we cannot tell a lie," murmured the sister, half aloud. It was broad daylight in the room. The light fell full on Monsieur Madeleine's face. The sister chanced to raise her eyes to it. "Good God, sir," she exclaimed, "what has happened to you? Your hair is perfectly white." "White?" said he. Sister Simplice had no mirror. She rummaged in a drawer and pulled out the little glass which the doctor of the infirmary used to see whether a patient was dead and whether he no longer breathed. Monsieur Madeleine took the mirror, looked at his hair, and said, "Well." He uttered the word indifferently, and as though his mind were on something else. The sister felt chilled by something strange of which she caught a glimpse in all this. He inquired, "Can I see her?" "Is not Monsieur le Maire going to have her child brought back to her?" said the sister, hardly venturing to put the question. "Of course, but it will take 2 or 3 days at least." "If she were not to see Monsieur le Maire until that time," went on the sister timidly, "she would not know that Monsieur le Maire had returned, and it would be easy to inspire her with patience. And when the child arrived, she would naturally think Monsieur le Maire had just come with the child. We should not have to enact a lie." Monsieur Madeleine seemed to reflect for a few moments. Then he said with his calm gravity, "No, sister, I must see her. I may, perhaps, be in haste." The nun did not appear to notice this word perhaps, which communicated an obscure and singular sense to the words of the mayor's speech. She replied, lowering her eyes and her voice respectfully, "In that case she is asleep, but Monsieur le Maire may enter." He made some remarks about a door which shut badly, and the noise of which might awaken the sick woman. Then he entered Fantine's chamber, approached the bed, and drew aside the curtains. She was asleep. Her breath issued from her breast with that tragic sound which is peculiar to those maladies, and which breaks the hearts of mothers when they are watching through the night beside their sleeping child who is condemned to death. But this painful respiration hardly troubled a sort of ineffable serenity which overspread her countenance and which transfigured her in her sleep. Her pallor had become whiteness, her cheeks were crimson, her long golden lashes, the only beauty of her youth, and her virginity which remained to her, palpitated, though they remained closed and drooping. Her whole person was trembling with an indescribable unfolding of wings, all ready to open wide and bear her away, which could be felt as they rustled, though they could not be seen. To see her thus, one would never have dreamed that she was an invalid whose life was almost despaired of. She resembled rather something on the point of soaring away than something on the point of dying. The branch trembles when a hand approaches it to pluck a flower, and seems to both withdraw and to offer itself at one and the same time. The human body has something of this tremor when the instant arrives in which the mysterious fingers of death are about to pluck the soul. Monsieur Madeleine remained for some time motionless beside that bed, gazing in turn upon the sick woman and the crucifix, as he had done 2 months before, on the day when he had come for the first time to see her in that asylum. They were both still there in the same attitude, she sleeping, he praying, only now, after the lapse of 2 months, her hair was grey, and his was white. The sister had not entered with him. He stood beside the bed with his finger on his lips, as though there were someone in the chamber whom he must enjoin to silence. She opened her eyes, saw him, and said quietly, with a smile, "And Cosette?" Chapter 2. Fantine happy. She made no movement of either surprise or of joy. She was joy itself. That simple question, "And Cosette?" was put with so profound a faith, with so much certainty, with such a complete absence of disquiet and of doubt, that he found not a word of reply. She continued, "I knew that you were there. I was asleep, but I saw you. I have seen you for a long, long time. I have been following you with my eyes all night long. You were in glory, and you had around you all sorts of celestial forms." He raised his glance to the crucifix. "But," she resumed, "tell me where Cosette is. Why did you not place her on my bed against the moment of my waking?" He made some mechanical reply, which he was never afterwards able to recall. Fortunately, the doctor had been warned, and he now made his appearance. He came to the aid of Monsieur Madeleine. "Calm yourself, my child," said the doctor. "Your child is here." Fantine's eyes beamed and filled her whole face with light. She clasped her hands with an expression which contained all that is possible to prayer in the way of violence and tenderness. "Oh," she exclaimed, "bring her to me." Touching illusion of a mother, Cosette was for her still the little child who is carried. "Not yet," said the doctor, "not just now. You still have some fever. The sight of your child would agitate you and do you harm. You must be cured first." She interrupted him impetuously. "But I am cured. Oh, I tell you that I am cured. What an ass that doctor is! The idea! I want to see my child." "You see," said the doctor, "how excited you become. So long as you are in this state, I shall oppose your having your child. It is not enough to see her. It is necessary that you should live for her. When you are reasonable, I will bring her to you myself." The poor mother bowed her head. "I beg your pardon, doctor, I really beg your pardon. Formerly, I should have never spoken as I have just done. So many misfortunes have happened to me that I sometimes do not know what I am saying. I understand you. You fear the emotion. I will wait as long as you like, but I swear to you that it would not have harmed me to see my daughter. I have been seeing her. I have not taken my eyes from her since yesterday evening. Do you know, if she were brought to me now, I should talk to her very gently. That is all. Is it not quite natural that I should desire to see my daughter, who has been brought to me expressly from Montfermeil? I am not angry. I know well that I am about to be happy. All night long I have seen white things and persons who smiled at me. When Monsieur le Doctor pleases, he shall bring me Cosette. I have no longer any fever. I am well. I am perfectly conscious that there is nothing the matter with me any more, but I am going to behave as though I were ill and not stir, to please these ladies here. When it is seen that I am very calm, they will say, 'She must have her child.'" Monsieur Madeleine was sitting on a chair beside the bed. She turned towards him. She was making a visible effort to be calm and very good, as she expressed it in the feebleness of illness which resembles infancy, in order that, seeing her so peaceable, they might make no difficulty about bringing Cosette to her. But while she controlled herself, she could not refrain from questioning Monsieur Madeleine. "Did you have a pleasant trip, Monsieur le Maire? Oh, how good you were to go and get her for me. Only tell me how she is. Did she stand the journey well? Alas, she will not recognize me. She must have forgotten me by this time, poor darling. Children have no memories. They are like birds. A child sees one thing today and another thing tomorrow, and thinks of nothing any longer. And did she have white linen? Did those Thénardiers keep her clean? How have they fed her? Oh, if you only knew how I have suffered, putting such questions as that to myself during all the time of my wretchedness. Now it is all past. I am happy. Oh, how I should like to see her. Do you think her pretty, Monsieur le Maire? Is not my daughter beautiful? You must have been very cold in that diligence. Could she not be brought for just one little instant? She might be taken away directly afterwards. Tell me, you are the master. It could be so if you choose. He took her hand. Cosette is beautiful, he said. Cosette is well. You shall see her soon, but calm yourself. You are talking with too much vivacity, and you are throwing your arms out from under the clothes, and that makes you cough. In fact, fits of coughing interrupted Fantine at nearly every word. Fantine did not murmur. She feared that she had injured by her too passionate lamentations the confidence which she was desirous of inspiring, and she began to talk of indifferent things. Montfermeil is quite pretty, is it not? People go there on pleasure parties in summer. Are the Thénardiers prosperous? There are not many travellers in their parts. That inn of theirs is a sort of a cook-shop. Monsieur Madeleine was still holding her hand and gazing at her with anxiety. It was evident that he had come to tell her things before which his mind now hesitated. The doctor, having finished his visit, retired. Sister Simplice remained alone with them. But in the midst of this pause, Fantine exclaimed, I hear her, mon Dieu, I hear her. She stretched out her arm to enjoin silence about her, held her breath, and began to listen with rapture. There was a child playing in the yard, the child of the portress or of some workwoman. It was one of those accidents which are always occurring and which seem to form a part of the mysterious stage setting of mournful scenes. The child, a little girl, was going and coming, running to warm herself, laughing, singing at the top of her voice. Alas, in what are the plays of children not intermingled? It was this little girl whom Fantine heard singing. Oh, she resumed, it is my Cosette. I recognize her voice. The child retreated as it had come. The voice died away. Fantine listened for a while longer, then her face clouded over, and Monsieur Madeleine heard her say in a low voice, How wicked that doctor is not to allow me to see my daughter. That man has an evil countenance, that he has. But the smiling background of her thoughts came to the front again. She continued to talk to herself with her head resting on the pillow. How happy we are going to be. We shall have a little garden, the very first thing. Monsieur Madeleine has promised it to me. My daughter will play in the garden. She must know her letters by this time. I will make her spell. She will run over the grass after butterflies. I will watch her. Then she will take her first communion. Oh, when will she take her first communion? She began to reckon on her fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. She is 7 years old. In 5 years she will have a white veil and open-work stockings. She will look like a little woman. Oh, my good sister, you do not know how foolish I become when I think of my daughter's first communion. She began to laugh. He had released Fantine's hand. He listened to her words as one listens to the sighing of the breeze, with his eyes on the ground, his mind absorbed in reflection which had no bottom. All at once she ceased speaking, and this caused him to raise his head mechanically. Fantine had become terrible. She no longer spoke, she no longer breathed. She had raised herself to a sitting posture. Her thin shoulder emerged from her chemise. Her face, which had been radiant but a moment before, was ghastly, and she seemed to have fixed her eyes, rendered large with terror, on something alarming at the other extremity of the room. Good God, he exclaimed. What ails you, Fantine? She made no reply. She did not remove her eyes from the object which she seemed to see. She removed one hand from his arm, and with the other made a sign to look behind him. He turned and beheld Javert. Chapter 3. Javert satisfied. This is what had taken place. The half an hour after midnight had just struck when Monsieur Madeleine quitted the Hall of Assizes in Arras. He regained his inn just in time to set out again by the mail wagon, in which he had engaged his place. A little before 6 o'clock in the morning he had arrived at M, and his first care had been to post a letter to Monsieur Laffitte, then to enter the infirmary and see Fantine. However, he had hardly quitted the audience hall of the Court of Assizes when the district attorney, recovering from his first shock, had taken the word to deplore the mad deed of the Honourable Mayor of M, to declare that his convictions had not been in the least modified by that curious incident, which would be explained thereafter, and to demand, in the meantime, the condemnation of that Champmathieu, who was evidently the real Jean Valjean. The district attorney's persistence was visibly at variance with the sentiments of everyone, of the public, of the court, and of the jury. The counsel for the defence had some difficulty in refuting this harangue, and in establishing that, in consequence of the revelations of Monsieur Madeleine, that is to say, of the real Jean Valjean, the aspect of the matter had been thoroughly altered, and that the jury had before their own eyes now only an innocent man. Hence the lawyer had drawn some epiphonimas, not very fresh, unfortunately, upon judicial errors, etc., etc. The president, in his summing up, had joined the counsel for the defence, and in a few minutes the jury had thrown Champmathieu out of the case. Nevertheless, the district attorney was bent on having a Jean Valjean, and as he had no longer Champmathieu, he took Madeleine. Immediately after Champmathieu had been set at liberty, the district attorney shut himself up with the president. They conferred as to the necessity of seizing the person of Monsieur le Maire of M. This phrase, in which there was a great deal of is the district attorney's, written with his own hand on the minutes of his report to the Attorney General. His first emotion having passed off, the president did not offer any objections. Justice must, after all, take its course. And then, when all was said, although the president was a kindly and a tolerably intelligent man, he was, at the same time, a devoted and almost an ardent royalist, and he had been shocked to hear that the mayor of M say the emperor and not Bonaparte when alluding to the landing at Cannes. The order for his arrest was accordingly dispatched. The district attorney forwarded it to M by a special messenger at full speed and entrusted its execution to Police Inspector Javert. The reader knows that Javert had returned to M immediately after having given his deposition. Javert was just getting out of bed when the messenger handed him the order of arrest and the command to produce the prisoner. The messenger himself was a very clever member of the police, who, in 2 words, informed Javert of what had taken place at Arras. The order of arrest, signed by the district attorney, was couched in these words: Inspector Javert will apprehend the body of the Sieur Madeleine, mayor of M, who, in this day's session of the court, was recognized as the liberated convict Jean Valjean. Anyone who did not know Javert and who had chanced to see him at the moment when he penetrated the antechamber of the infirmary could have divined nothing of what had taken place, and would have thought his air the most ordinary in the world. He was cool, calm, grave. His grey hair was perfectly smooth upon his temples, and he had just mounted the stairs with his habitual deliberation. Anyone who was thoroughly acquainted with him, and who had examined him attentively at the moment, would have shuddered. The buckle of his leather stock was under his left ear instead of at the nape of his neck. This betrayed unwonted agitation. Javert was a complete character, who never had a wrinkle in his duty or in his uniform, methodical with malefactors, rigid with the buttons of his coat. That he should have set the buckle of his stock awry, it was indispensable that there should have been taken place in him one of those emotions which may be designated as internal earthquakes. He had come in a simple way, had made a requisition on the neighbouring post for a corporal and 4 soldiers, had left the soldiers in the courtyard, had had Fantine's room pointed out to him by the portress, who was utterly unsuspicious, accustomed as she was to seeing armed men inquiring for the mayor. On arriving at Fantine's chamber, Javert turned the handle, pushed the door open with the gentleness of a sick nurse or a police spy, and entered. Properly speaking, he did not enter. He stood erect in the half-open door, his hat on his head and his left hand thrust into his coat, which was buttoned up to the chin. In the bend of his elbow, the leaden head of his enormous cane, which was hidden behind him, could be seen. Thus he remained for nearly a minute without his presence being perceived. All at once Fantine raised her eyes, saw him, and made Monsieur Madeleine turn round. The instant that Madeleine's glance encountered Javert's glance, Javert, without stirring, without moving from his post, without approaching him, became terrible. No human sentiment can be as terrible as joy. It was the visage of a demon who has just found his damned soul. The satisfaction of at last getting hold of Jean Valjean caused all that was in his soul to appear in his countenance. The depths, having been stirred up, mounted to the surface. The humiliation of having, in some slight degree, lost the scent, and of having indulged, for a few moments, in an error with regard to Champmathieu, was effaced by pride at having so well and accurately divined in the first place, and of having for so long cherished a just instinct. Javert's content shone forth in his sovereign attitude. The deformity of triumph overspread that narrow brow. All the demonstrations of horror which a satisfied face can afford were there. Javert was in heaven at that moment. Without putting the thing clearly to himself, but with a confused intuition of the necessity of his presence and of his success, he, Javert, personified justice, light, and truth in their celestial function of crushing out evil. Behind him and around him, at an infinite distance, he had authority, reason, the case judged, the legal conscience, the public prosecution, all the stars. He was protecting order. He was causing the law to yield up its thunders. He was avenging society. He was lending a helping hand to the absolute. He was standing erect in the midst of a glory. There existed in his victory a remnant of defiance and of combat. Erect, haughty, brilliant, he flaunted abroad in open day the superhuman bestiality of a ferocious archangel. The terrible shadow of action which he was accomplishing caused the vague flash of the social sword to be visible in his clenched fist. Happy and indignant, he held his heel upon crime, vice, rebellion, perdition, hell. He was radiant, he exterminated, he smiled, and there was an incontestable grandeur in this monstrous St. Michael. Javert, though frightful, had nothing ignoble about him. Probity, sincerity, candor, conviction, the sense of duty are things which may become hideous when wrongly directed, but which, even when hideous, remain grand. Their majesty, the majesty peculiar to the human conscience, clings to them in the midst of horror. They are virtues which have one vice. The honest, pitiless joy of a fanatic in the full flood of his atrocity preserves a certain lugubriously venerable radiance. Without himself suspecting the fact, Javert, in his formidable happiness, was to be pitied, as is every ignorant man who triumphs. Nothing could be so poignant and so terrible as this face, wherein was displayed all that may be designated as the evil of the good. Chapter 4. Authority reasserts its rights. Fantine had not seen Javert since the day on which the mayor had torn her from the man. Her ailing brain comprehended nothing, but the only thing which she did not doubt was that he had come to get her. She could not endure that terrible face. She felt her life quitting her. She hid her face in both hands, and she shrieked in her anguish. "Monsieur Madeleine, save me!" Jean Valjean, we shall henceforth not speak of him otherwise, had risen. He said to Fantine, in the gentlest and calmest of voices, "Be at ease, it is not for you that he has come." Then he addressed Javert and said, "I know what you want." Javert replied, "Be quick about it." There lay in the inflection of voice which accompanied these words something indescribably fierce and frenzied. Javert did not say, "Be quick about it." He said, "Be quick about it." No orthography can do justice to the accent with which it was uttered. It was no longer a human word. It was a roar. He did not proceed according to his custom. He did not enter into the matter. He exhibited no warrant of arrest. In his eyes, Jean Valjean was a sort of mysterious combatant who was not to be laid hands upon, a wrestler in the dark whom he had had in his grip for the last 5 years without being able to throw him. This arrest was not a beginning but an end. He confined himself to saying, "Be quick about it." As he spoke thus, he did not advance a single step. He hurled at Jean Valjean a glance which he threw out like a grappling hook, and with which he was accustomed to draw wretches violently to him. It was this glance which Fantine had felt penetrating to the very marrow of her bones 2 months previously. At Javert's exclamation, Fantine opened her eyes once more, but the mayor was there. What had she to fear? Javert advanced to the middle of the room and cried, "See here now, art thou coming?" The unhappy woman glanced about her. No one was present excepting the nun and the mayor. To whom could that abject use of thou be addressed? To her only. She shuddered. Then she beheld a most unprecedented thing, a thing so unprecedented that nothing equal to it had appeared to her even in the blackest deliriums of fever. She beheld Javert, the police spy, seize the mayor by the collar. She saw the mayor bow his head. It seemed to her that the world was coming to an end. Javert had, in fact, grasped Jean Valjean by the collar. "Monsieur le Maire!" shrieked Fantine. Javert burst out laughing with that frightful laugh which displayed all his gums. "There is no longer any Monsieur le Maire here." Jean Valjean made no attempt to disengage the hand which grasped the collar of his coat. He said, "Javert." Javert interrupted him. "Call me Mr. Inspector." "Monsieur," said Jean Valjean, "I should like to say a word to you in private." "Aloud, say it aloud," replied Javert. "People are in the habit of talking aloud to me." Jean Valjean went on in a lower tone. "I have a request to make of you. I tell you to speak loud, but you alone should hear it. What difference does that make to me? I shall not listen." Jean Valjean turned towards him and said very rapidly and in a very low voice, "Grant me 3 days' grace, 3 days in which to go and fetch the child of this unhappy woman. I will pay whatever is necessary. You shall accompany me if you choose." "You are making sport of me," cried Javert. "Come now, I did not think you such a fool. You ask me to give you 3 days in which to run away. You say that it is for the purpose of fetching that creature's child? Ha! That's good. That's really capital." Fantine was seized with a fit of trembling. "My child!" she cried. "To go and fetch my child! She is not here, then? Answer me, sister, where is Cosette? I want my child. Monsieur Madeleine! Monsieur le Maire!" Javert stamped his foot. "And now there's the other one. Will you hold your tongue, you hussy? It's a pretty sort of a place where convicts are magistrates and where women of the town are cared for like countesses. But we are going to change all that. It is high time." He stared intently at Fantine and added, once more taking into his grasp Jean Valjean's cravat, shirt, and collar, "I tell you that there is no Monsieur Madeleine and there is no Monsieur le Maire. There is a thief, a brigand, a convict named Jean Valjean, and I have him in my grasp. That's what there is." Fantine raised herself in bed with a bound. Supporting herself on her stiffened arms and on both hands, she gazed at Jean Valjean. She gazed at Javert. She gazed at the nun. She opened her mouth as though to speak. A rattle proceeded from the depths of her throat. Her teeth chattered. She stretched out her arms in her agony, opening her hands convulsively and fumbling about her like a drowning person, then suddenly fell back on her pillow. Her head struck the headboard of the bed and fell forwards on her breasts, with gaping mouth and staring, sightless eyes. She was dead. Jean Valjean laid his hand upon the detaining hand of Javert, and opened it as he would have opened the hand of a baby. Then he said to Javert, "You have murdered that woman." "Let's have an end of this," shouted Javert in a fury. "I am not here to listen to argument. Let us economize all that. The guard is below. March on instantly, or you'll get the thumbscrews." In the corner of the room stood an old iron bedstead, which was in a decidedly decrepit state, and which served the sisters as a camp bed when they were watching with the sick. Jean Valjean stepped up to this bed in a twinkling, wrenched off the headpiece, which was already in a dilapidated condition, an easy matter to muscles like his, grasped the principal rod like a bludgeon, and glanced at Javert. Javert retreated towards the door. Jean Valjean, armed with his bar of iron, walked slowly up to Fantine's couch. When he arrived there, he turned and said to Javert in a voice that was barely audible, "I advise you not to disturb me at this moment." One thing is certain, and that is that Javert trembled. It did occur to him to summon the guard, but Jean Valjean might avail himself of that moment to effect his escape. So he remained, grasped his cane by the small end, and leaned against the doorpost without removing his eyes from Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean rested his elbow on the knob at the head of the bed, and with his brow on his hand, and began to contemplate the motionless body of Fantine, which lay extended there. He remained thus, mute, absorbed, evidently with no further thought of anything connected with his life. Upon his face and in his attitude there was nothing but inexpressible pity. After a few moments of this meditation, he bent towards Fantine and spoke to her in a low voice. What did he say to her? What could this man who was reproved say to that woman who was dead? What words were those? No one on earth heard them. Did the dead woman hear them? There are some touching illusions which are perhaps sublime realities. The point as to which there exists no doubt is that Sister Simplice, the sole witness of the incident, often said that at the moment that Jean Valjean whispered in Fantine's ear, she distinctly beheld an ineffable smile drawn on those pale lips, and in those dim eyes filled with the amazement of the tomb. Jean Valjean took Fantine's head in both his hands, and arranged it on the pillow as a mother might have done for her child. And then he tied the string of her chemise and smoothed her hair back under her cap. That done, he closed her eyes. Fantine's face seemed strangely illuminated at that moment. Death, that signifies entrance into the great light. Fantine's hand was hanging over the side of the bed. Jean Valjean knelt down before that hand, lifted it gently, and kissed it. Then he rose and turned to Javert. "Now," said he, "I am at your disposal." Chapter 5. A Suitable Tomb. Javert deposited Jean Valjean in the city prison. The arrest of Monsieur Madeleine occasioned a sensation, or rather an extraordinary commotion in M. We are sorry that we cannot conceal the fact that, at the single word, he was a convict. Nearly everyone deserted him. In less than 2 hours all the good that he had done had been forgotten, and he was nothing but a convict from the galleys. It is just to add that the details of what had taken place at Arras were not yet known. All day long conversations like the following were to be heard in all quarters of the town. "You don't know? He was a liberated convict." "Who? The mayor?" "Ah, Monsieur Madeleine." "Yes, really. His name was not Madeleine at all. He had a frightful name. Boujean. Ah, good God. He has been arrested, in prison, in the city prison, while waiting to be transferred. Until he is transferred, he is to be transferred. Where is he to be taken? He will be tried at the assizes for a highway robbery which he committed long ago. Well, I suspected as much. That man was too good, too perfect, too affected. He refused the cross. He bestowed sous on all the little scamps he came across. I always thought there was some evil history back of all that." The drawing-rooms particularly abounded in remarks of this nature. One old lady, a subscriber to the Drapeau Blanc, made the following remark, the depth of which it is impossible to fathom. "I am not sorry. It will be a lesson to the Bonapartists." It was thus that the phantom which had been called Monsieur Madeleine vanished from M. Only 3 or 4 persons in all the town remained faithful to his memory. The old portress who had served him was among the number. On the evening of that day, the worthy old woman was sitting in her lodge, still in a thorough fright, and absorbed in sad reflections. The factory had been closed all day, the carriage gate was bolted, the street was deserted. There was no one in the house but the two nuns, Sister Perpétue and Sister Simplice, who were watching beside the body of Fantine. Towards the hour when Monsieur Madeleine was accustomed to return home, the good portress rose mechanically, took from a drawer the key of Monsieur Madeleine's chamber, and the flat candlestick which he used every evening to go up to his quarters. Then she hung the key on the nail whence he was accustomed to take it, and set the candlestick on one side, as though she was expecting him. And then she sat down again on her chair and became absorbed in thought once more. The poor, good old woman had done all this without being conscious of it. It was only at the expiration of 2 hours that she roused herself from her reverie and exclaimed, "Hold, my good God Jesus, and I hung his key on the nail." At that moment the small window in the lodge opened, a hand passed through, seized the key and the candlestick, and lighted the taper at the candle which was burning there. The portress raised her eyes and stood there with gaping mouth and a shriek which she confined to her throat. She knew that hand, that arm, the sleeve of that coat. It was Monsieur Madeleine. It was several seconds before she could speak. She had a seizure, as she said herself, when she related the adventure afterwards. "Good God, Monsieur le Maire," she cried at last, "I thought you were—" She stopped. The conclusion of her sentence would have been lacking in respect towards the beginning. Jean Valjean was still Monsieur le Maire to her. He finished her thought. "In prison," said he. "I was there. I broke a bar of one of the windows. I let myself drop from the top of a roof, and here I am. I am going up to my room. Go and find Sister Simplice for me. She is with that poor woman, no doubt." The old woman obeyed in all haste. He gave her no orders. He was quite sure that she would guard him better than he should guard himself. No one ever found out how he had managed to get into the courtyard without opening the big gates. He had, and had always carried about him, a pass-key which opened a little side door, but he must have been searched, and his latch-key must have been taken from him. This point was never explained. He ascended the staircase leading to his chamber. On arriving at the top, he left his candle on the top step of his stairs, opened his door with very little noise, went and closed his window and his shutters by feeling, then returned for his candle and re-entered his room. It was a useful precaution. It will be recollected that his window could be seen from the street. He cast a glance about him, at his table, at his chair, at his bed, which had not been disturbed for 3 days. No trace of the disorder of the night before last remained. The portress had done up his room. Only she had picked out of the ashes and placed neatly on the table the 2 iron ends of the cudgel and the 40-sou piece which had been blackened by the fire. He took a sheet of paper on which he wrote, "These are the 2 tips of my iron-shod cudgel and the 40-sou piece stolen from little Gervais, which I mentioned at the court of assizes." And he arranged this piece of paper, the bits of iron, and the coin in such a way that they were the first things to be seen on entering the room. From a cupboard he pulled out one of his old shirts, which he tore in pieces. In the strips of linen thus prepared he wrapped the 2 silver candlesticks. He betrayed neither haste nor agitation, and while he was wrapping up the bishop's candlesticks, he nibbled at a piece of black bread. It was probably the prison bread which he had carried with him in his flight. This was proved by the crumbs which were found on the floor of the room where the authorities made an examination later on. There came 2 taps at the door. "Come in," said he. It was Sister Simplice. She was pale, her eyes were red, the candle which she carried trembled in her hand. The peculiar feature of the violences of destiny is, that however polished or cool we may be, they wring human nature from our very bowels and force it to reappear on the surface. The emotions of that day had turned the nun into a woman once more. She had wept, and she was trembling. Jean Valjean had just finished writing a few lines on a paper, which he handed to the nun, saying, "Sister, you will give this to Monsieur le Curé." The paper was not folded. She cast a glance upon it. "You can read it," said he. She read, I beg Monsieur le Curé to keep an eye on all that I leave behind me. He will be so good as to pay out of it the expenses of my trial and of the funeral of the woman who died yesterday. The rest is for the poor." The sister tried to speak, but she only managed to stammer a few inarticulate sounds. She succeeded in saying, however, "Does not Monsieur le Maire desire to take a last look at that poor, unhappy woman?" "No," said he. "I am pursued. It would only end in their arresting me in that room, and that would disturb her." He had already finished when a loud noise became audible on the staircase. They heard a tumult of ascending footsteps, and the old portress saying in her loudest and most piercing tones, "My good sir, I swear to you by the good God that not a soul has entered this house all day nor all the evening, and that I have not even left the door." A man responded, "But there is a light in that room nevertheless." They recognized Javert's voice. The chamber was so arranged that the door in opening masked the corner of the wall on the right. Jean Valjean blew out the candle and placed himself in this angle. Sister Simplice fell on her knees near the table. The door opened. Javert entered. The whispers of many men and the protestations of the portress were audible in the corridor. The nun did not raise her eyes. She was praying. The candle was on the chimney-piece and gave but very little light. Javert caught sight of the nun and halted in amazement. It will be remembered that the fundamental point in Javert, his element, the very air he breathed, was veneration for all authority. This was impregnable and admitted of neither objection nor restriction. In his eyes, of course, the ecclesiastical authority was the chief of all. He was religious, superficial, and correct on this point as on all others. In his eyes, a priest was a mind who never makes a mistake. A nun was a creature who never sins. They were souls walled in from this world, with a single door which never opened except to allow the truth to pass through. On perceiving the sister, his first movement was to retire. But there was also another duty which bound him and impelled him imperiously in the opposite direction. His second movement was to remain and to venture on at least one question. This was Sister Simplice, who had never told a lie in her life. Javert knew it, and held her in special veneration in consequence. "Sister," said he, "are you alone in this room?" A terrible moment ensued, during which the poor portress felt as though she should faint. The sister raised her eyes and answered, "Yes." "Then," resumed Javert, "you will excuse me if I persist. It is my duty. You have not seen a certain person, a man, this evening. He has escaped. We are in search of him. That Jean Valjean. You have not seen him." The sister replied, "No." She lied. She had lied twice in succession, one after the other, without hesitation, promptly, as a person does when sacrificing herself. "Pardon me," said Javert, and he retired with a deep bow. "O sainted maid, you left this world many years ago. You have rejoined your sisters, the virgins, and your brothers, the angels in the light. May this lie be counted to your credit in paradise." The sister's affirmation was for Javert so decisive a thing that he did not even observe the singularity of that candle, which had but just been extinguished and which was still smoking on the table. An hour later, a man, marching amid trees and mists, was rapidly departing from M. in the direction of Paris. That man was Jean Valjean. It has been established by the testimony of 2 or 3 courtiers who met him that he was carrying a bundle, that he was dressed in a blouse. Where had he obtained that blouse? No one ever found out. But an aged workman had died in the infirmary of the factory a few days before, leaving behind him nothing but his blouse. Perhaps that was the one. One last word about Fantine. We all have a mother, the earth. Fantine was given back to that mother. The curé thought that he was doing right, and perhaps he really was, in reserving as much money as possible from what Jean Valjean had left for the poor. Who was concerned, after all? A convict and a woman of the town. That is why he had a very simple funeral for Fantine, and reduced it to that strictly necessary form known as the pauper's grave. So Fantine was buried in the free corner of the cemetery which belongs to anybody and everybody, and where the poor are lost. Fortunately, God knows where to find the soul again. Fantine was laid in the shade among the first bones that came to hand. She was subjected to the promiscuousness of ashes. She was thrown into the public grave. Her grave resembled her bed. The end of Volume 1, Fantine.